Welcome everybody to our BVIPsych webinar series, Giftedness panel discussion. I'm Meaghan, school psychologist with the California School for the Blind Assessment Center and co-coordinator for BVIPsych. BVIPsych is a National Association of School Psychologists interest group. And so if you're not a paying member of NAS, we do have a Google group for school psychologists and mental health professionals that is also called BVIPsych. So we'll drop we'll drop a link in the chat for the group if you'd like to sign up. This school year, we are really happy to be offering a series of free webinars about various topics related to working with blind, low vision, and deafblind students. The next webinar in our series will be a presentation on learning disabilities that will be on Wednesday, October 8th. A registration link for that will also be put in the chat in a bit. And just to let you know, there is also a new interest group on our Google groups coming from the California School for the Blind for SLPs, our speech language pathologist friends. So you'll be provided that resource as well. And so now on to our main event. We are pleased to have an expert panel with us today to address your questions on giftedness and visual impairment. Our lovely panelists will introduce themselves and we'll start with Marnee.
Hi, I'm Marnee Loftin, and I am a happily retired previous employee of Texas School for the Blind and Visually Impaired. I've always tell people to start off that I kind of backed into the field. I wanted to find a job that allowed me to have summers off with my children. And to put it into perspective, my grandchildren are now in college. So I loved working there, worked there for almost 30 years, learned a lot. My background was in clinical psych, so I had a lot to learn. I guess I'm pretty much retired now. I do a few things. Occasionally, I'll do a workshop. I still do some reviews for the professional journals, which I enjoy. Thrilled to death to be on this panel. I presented something this summer for the Gifted and Talented professional group here in Texas, and it was interesting to hear their comments about the difficulty with students with visual impairment. So delighted to be here. I would like to extend very grateful thanks to the people who've helped me master the technology in order to be here. So May and I've been angels, so here I am.
Thank you so much, Marnee, and we'll go over to Brian.
My name's Brian Mullen. I'm a school psychologist in Tooele County, and I'm the co-coordinator with May. She's a much better and professional speaker than I am. And yeah, I kind of got into this topic and field following in the footsteps of Marnee. I just love talking about this stuff. So, oh, I'm from Utah, just west of Salt Lake City. And I'll have Mandy go because she's the other person I see on the screen.
Hi, everybody. My name is Mandy Gauld, and I'm in Austin, Texas. I currently work at Texas School for the Blind and Visually Impaired, and I am an educational diagnostician. And I kind of backed into this field too. I started out in general ed. I was a teacher, English, language arts, and then took many years off to kind of raise my kids. And then I found a way into the field of educational diagnostician, which is something we only have in a few states, including mine. And this was my first job, and this is my 4th year here. So everything I've learned about being a diagnostician, I learned in the field of visual impairment. So I'm happy to be here with this great group and looking forward to hearing your questions. Meaghan, would you like to go next?
Sure. I'm Meaghan Adams. I am in Wichita, Kansas with Wichita Public Schools. This is my 21st year as a school psychologist. We have daily VI service programming at the elementary and middle and high school level in Wichita Public Schools. In one of the schools that I used to be a school psychologist at, I had our elementary programming. So I was fortunate enough to work with that population for a number of years. For the past 5 years, I've been a special education coordinator. So I coordinate some of our special education programming, so our visually impaired programming, and our gifted programming, and then some of our other programs. So I'm definitely, I'm not an expert, but I love working with these kids and have been very blessed to work with these populations. So.
And last but not least, Dr. Kim, if you want to go ahead.
Hi, everybody. My name is Dr. Kimberly Avila. I am the professor in charge of the teacher preparation program in blindness and vision impairment at George Mason University. We are in Northern Virginia, just outside of Washington, D.C. I do have low vision, and I am also the parent, a very proud parent of 2 daughters who have a different vision condition than what I have. And my youngest is a senior in high school right now, going through one of the most complex AP honors classes that I could ever imagine, way beyond what I could ever comprehend. Going through her back to school night a couple of weeks ago, I was just in awe and overwhelmed at AP Physics, AP Calc, AP Computer Science. And here she is, legally blind, just excelling, doing French 5 as dual enrollment, and so much more. And then my other daughter is a university student and also doing exceptionally well. And, coming near to the end of this journey, all the things that I had to do as a parent, and also reflecting back as a teacher of the students who are blind and visually impaired, and also as a professor now in the blindness field, we have a lot to do. We are busy parents, and it's something that takes a lot of time and consideration. I'm really, really thankful to be here today. So thank you, May.
Thank you everyone for introducing yourselves, and I'm going to drop in the chat now the questions that were submitted before this webinar started during registration. So we'll be going over the panelists' response for these questions, but if you have additional questions, feel free to drop it in the chat. And I'm so sorry, I should have said this at the beginning. If you're looking for ASL interpretation, click the interpretation button that is on the bottom of your Zoom screen so that you'll be able to see the ASL American Sign Language channel. And so sorry again for forgetting to mention that at the start. And so now we'll go on to start our first question. And it is, what were the results of the inquiry that they, meaning Brian, Meaghan, and Mandy, did regarding the assessment of gifted and talented blind, low vision students?
So this was more of a broad generalization of just overall evaluation of students with disabilities. So we looked at districts in Kansas and Texas. And so we got 45 responses. 55% of the districts were rural, 36 were suburban, 5% were urban, and then we got 5% from charter schools. Most of the districts were pretty small, less than 5,000 students. 10 were 5,000 to 25,000, and 8 were greater than 25,000 students. Most of them used group administered assessments, and then 20 used individually administered. Some used a combination of both. And then a majority did consider academic assessments, both individually and group administered. Most of them used the COGAT. Some used the NAGLI area, and some used the NNAT. The WISC was a common one, so was the WJ-COG, and then the RIAS and the KABC. The standard academic achievement ones were used for the individually administered, such as the KTEA, the WJ4, the Wyatt, and the IO assessments were the most common group administered. And then we asked, do you use rating scales as part of your gifted and talented identification process? And 81% said yes, which is good. We wanted them to look at a more holistic approach. Then we asked what accommodations they provided for students with disabilities. 10 of the total districts said none. 15 said any accommodation that was in their IEP or 504. Then 2 just said they used testing from their special education eligibility, and then said they don't do any additional testing. 2 said, 4 said they used accommodations allowed by the assessment. 4 said they used extra time. Some said they enlarged screens. And then 3 said nonverbal options. So, and then 1 district said they vary depending on their specific disability. So, as you can see, there's a wide variation in terms of what districts are doing in terms of providing for students with disability and their specific needs in terms of identifying them just in terms of the assessment portion, not even in terms of looking at varying the eligibility process. Very few had any standardized rating scale that varied to look at different needs of the students. Some used the Hope Teacher Scale, the GATES, the Gifted and Talented Evaluation Scale. So, and again, a lot of these assessments have portions that require processing speed, visual spatial task, and heavily loaded for working memory. So they're not great in terms of that. And then a lot of people mentioned that they also require a global score and not just a specific index or cluster group. So those were the main findings that we found from that assessment. So not great in terms of any student with a disability, but specifically students with a visual impairments or blindness. So that's kind of what we found.
Thank you so much for sharing about that, Brian. And our next question, well, it was a little bit of a comment and question. The registrant said, I would like more explanation of how to identify the gifted traits. What are some indicators of giftedness, and maybe some charts to organize the typical gifted and talented traits and how they are exhibited in blind and low vision populations would be helpful. And so I'll turn it over to Meaghan and Marnee to address this one.
And I may start off because Meaghan has much more specific data to share. I just kind of wanted to at least talk about some general things to begin with. You know, it's interesting because I have been in residential schools long enough to see a tremendous change in the population there. And when I start counting, I probably have tested over 2,000 children. It's kind of depressing when I think about how many I have tested over the years. So I don't have a lot of statistical data, but I do have a lot of kind of clinical data. And I used to have a lot of good hard data until they destroyed the building that my hard data was in. So that was quite a trauma for me. When I talk to parents, there's always kind of this flurry of phone calls come the spring because so many people will talk to a young child, particularly those who are totally blind, and be totally convinced based upon their vocabulary that this is a gifted and talented child. And it may be, you know, there's There are some characteristics, though, just kind of some general things that I would always try to ask these people that would call about how do you qualify a child, because I do think that these characteristics are very typical of those students who are truly gifted and talented. And I guess I will add at this point in time, maybe to give me some credibility, I have a brother who is low vision. And let me assure you, that's not why I went into the field, because I was always convinced that he was faking because he had low vision. And so I was very, very irritated at the attention that he got. But he does have low vision, very, very bright. He's a tenured professor of international economics at one of the Ivy League schools. So high achieving, has been through all sorts of things to get to where he is. But when I stopped to think about the characteristics of this brother, and I kind of combined it with some of the experiences that I've had at TSB, I think there's three things that really stand out with these kids. One, they're curious. They're always asking you questions about the world. What I observed with many of the students is they would ask just kind of these rote kind of cocktail party conversations. But the child who is really gifted, in my experience, is the one that's really asking the why questions, is trying to understand. They're always trying to build upon concepts that they already have, even at the most basic levels. They're really one of them that sticks out in my mind was a child that was really trying to conceptualize how is it that Hawaii is an island and Australia is not. They're both surrounded by water, trying to really get those concepts across. So they're always kind of thinking one step ahead of you. The other thing that I think characterizes these kids is they're really efficient learners. They pick up things quickly. They tend to be able to break things, almost do their own personal task analysis when they're learning a new task. Definitely conceptual skills that are above the student who is not gifted. All of the literature tells us, in spite of our sometimes discriminatory belief that these are all nerds, like watching a TV show, kids who are gifted typically are more social and just generally a little bit more emotionally stable. That has been noted in study after study, that they really are not the nerds that are sitting over in the corner. So what I think, before we get into the real specifics too, I think there's a couple of things that we really need to be aware of when we start looking at trying to identify these characteristics. It's the good news and the bad news, because the government has not come up with real standardized criteria for how do you determine that a child is gifted and talented. They have pretty much left it up to the states. And as I say, that's good or bad news, because some states have come up with a very, very rigid interpretation. Some of them have been much more flexible. Strangely enough, I think Texas is one of the more flexible ones, probably because we have such a large population of non-English speakers. They really look at nonverbal tests, they look at problem-solving skills, etc. There is a problem, as you might guess, with looking at nonverbal skills, because that is very much discriminatory toward children who are visually impaired. When you're doing these visual analogies, you can't adapt them, you can't accommodate them. So what's a blessing for someone is a curse for another one. The other thing that I think really keeps these students from being identified is that we tend, well, hold on just a sec. I'm so traumatized by trying to get to the technology that I forgot the content.
No worries, Marnee. And so I do have you slated to talk more about assessment in a little bit, but I do want to give Meaghan a chance to share some of the resources that she has compiled to address this question too. But both of you are on our next question, so you can compile your thoughts while Meaghan gets her turn.
That's good. And I'm sorry, I took up too much of your time, Meaghan.
You're good. I could sit and listen to you all day, so it's totally fine.
Oh,
In the handouts, we tried to compile something that would be helpful and useful for teams as they're comparing, what would be typical gifted characteristics, and then how those may present themselves in our sighted kiddos, and how they may present themselves, those characteristics may present in our kiddos with visual impairment. So there is a chart specifically for that addresses that within the handout. And it's not an all-inclusive list. Again, it's just some of the typical gifted traits. Like, for example, the first one is advanced vocabulary and verbal skills. And then it goes on to the next column, and it says how it may present in sighted students. So sighted students may have early use of complex vocabulary, fluent story telling, wordplay, uses advanced words, expresses ideas clearly in speech and print, and then how it may present itself in our students with visual impairment. So they also may display advanced rich oral language skills, advanced listening comprehension. They probably prefer spoken expression over written, and they also excel in those oral language skills, storytelling, and then auditory expression. So it just really goes through several different areas. And then the next chart below that goes a little bit into potential misinterpretation of gifted traits in our kiddos with visual impairments. For example, high verbal ability, and I've heard this several times. I've heard these kiddos seen as too talkative or too dominating or wanting attention. And really, we want to look for the positive and not for the negative, and instead ask, what is their depth of thought? What is the vocabulary that they're using? Is it complex vocabulary? What's their ability to explain concepts beyond a typical kiddo of their age or grade level? So I won't get into too much detail. We'll let you reference the handout. Unless May, you want me to go into more detail about anything else?
Now, that was great. Thank you, Meaghan, for doing a quick overview. And Kim, I see you have a hand, so go ahead.
Thank you. And I just want to draw back on serving as a teacher of students with visual impairments and blindness, and working a lot with a population of children who are totally blind, children who are neurodivergent, children who are nonverbal. We do see gifted and talentedness. We see a lot of students who can excel, and it's a little more challenging to detect. I've had students who've had behavior problems because they are simply bored and they're not being challenged in the way that they need to be challenged. So while we have some fantastic criteria, if you spend any time in the blindness field, you know that there is always the exception. And so we want to make sure we look holistically at our children and students, look at what types of traits and features they have that are going to be different, and also take into account if they have concurrent disabilities, if they are nonverbal, if they have neurodiversity or other factors as well.
Great. Thanks for sharing that, Kim. And Marnee, did you want to follow up on that?
I just was going to follow up because I think that's really true. When we talk about gifted children, we tend to think about academically gifted. That tends to be our discussion. And when I talk to parents, that was almost always what they were looking at. But one of the things that I always tried to ask them is, if you want to develop the things that your child is interested in, what do you need to look at? It may be better that they participate in a little theater group, or, really get involved with some other activities, the robotics club, etc. We can't get away from the fact that gifted and talented programs typically take longer for kids. There's more homework, there's more reading, there's more, et cetera, things that are involved with that. And so I think we need to really take a look as professionals and as parents at exactly what are we trying to accomplish and how best to do that. So, and I don't know, we had a student at the School for the Blind that we never managed to toilet train by the age of 18. And he was able to sit down and duplicate any piece of music on the piano. I mean, it was very clear that he was gifted and talented in that particular field. So I don't know what you do with those types of students. Scratch my head then, I still am. So.
Thanks so much for sharing your experience and thoughts on that for everyone. Just in looking at the time and want to make sure we get to all the questions, I'm going to move us forward to question number 3, which is what assessments are available? And I know we kind of touched on this a little earlier too, but what assessments are available to assess giftedness in visually impaired children? What enlarged standardized assessments or protocols and resources are available? Should we be more flexible and consider the use of part of scores or even single subtest scores that have high G loadings and reliability? For example, with arithmetic, when we're required to meet an IQ threshold. So I'll let you guys take that away.
Okay, I think I'm taking it away. I would like to stress that almost all of them are going to require some type of intelligence test, cognitive test, etc. The other thing that I want to stress is that there is a position paper that's available through the American Printing House for the Blind that talks about guidelines for for obtaining some type of general estimate of cognitive abilities. Meaghan and several others revised that document. I don't know if it's up there yet, but the one that's already there is noted in the WISC manual. It's appearing in all of the different professional journals as a way to get an estimate of cognitive abilities. What I have done over the years is I've put together kind of a 3-prong approach, and we'll talk about that when we get to the case study. But it's kind of the qualitative aspect of giftedness, and it consists of, number one, really interviewing the student in terms of what their goals are, what would they like to accomplish in the time that they have. To be real certain that those things fit. I also will typically ask them to write an essay. The essay is totally something that I decide upon based upon what their interest seems to be, what seems to be the hot topic. I have asked kids before to write an essay as to why the curfew should be extended, because it gives us a chance to kind of see what their logic is. Write a letter to the principal complaining about a discipline policy. Write a brief summary of a current news event. So it gives you an idea of that. I also try to include observational data in this determination of eligibility, because I think it's important to determine how independent those students are in using all of the adaptive devices. I always question whether it's the right time to put a child in one of the gifted and talented programs if they're learning a new technology, if they're learning a new media. Is that going to be absolutely overwhelming? So I look at that. I also interview the parents and the teachers to see exactly how does this child problem solve. Because I think that the IQ score is just one piece of it. And because the IQ score is so tentative that we obtain, I think it's really important to add to that data in every way that you possibly can. Meaghan, do I have time to talk about a program that TSB ran for a number of years? Because I think sometimes asking a public school to provide a very specialized program for the child who's who's gifted and talented and visually impaired is sometimes a very difficult task. So for about 3 or 4 years, TSB ran something called Camp Challenge, which was probably the most fun, and I hope that someday someone will duplicate it again. Do I have more time to say anything? When I
Love,
see Meaghan's face.
Marnee, I don't know, Meaghan, I know you prepared a lot for this question. Do you want to go into some of what you wanted to share, and then we can get into like some specific examples from Marnee after?
Yeah. I mean, this is the beautiful thing of having a handout, right? We can always say refer to the handout. So if you know, want to peruse the handout, I think it's on pages 11 through 13. It just talks about what assessments can be available. Just making a quick point as school psychologists, sometimes I think we get in a rut. We have a standard battery of tests, and our comfort zone is our standardized tests. We've really pushed to move away from standardized testing, especially when it comes to gift identification. We have a very diverse population within the Wichita Public Schools. Our students speak over 100 different languages. We are trying to look at twice exceptional students and just consider more things. So I think you just need to be really cognizant and start with the student's strengths and needs, and then build your standardized assessment or assessment protocol around that. So it talks a lot about, there is a section for standardized assessments, but it talks about alternative assessments. So we use a lot of dynamic assessments within our schools. We use a lot of portfolios for our kiddos that we're looking at for gifted, and it's worked really well. Not, you know, for our diverse populations. So our CLD students, our students with visual impairments, our students with specific learning disabilities. And then we are fortunate enough in Kansas on our eligibility indicators, there's 6 different indicators that we can look at, and standardized cognitive testing is only 1 out of the 6. So it does talk about record reviews and interviews and rating scales, and again, portfolios and those kinds of things. So just really encouraging our school psychologists, if you're not familiar with those things, there's a ton of resources. Texas, I'll give a shout out to Texas. They were my go-to back in the day when I was learning all about building a portfolio. I sat in on several professional development sessions with Texas. And so again, just encouraging you to go search for your own professional development so you can ensure that you're doing valid assessments for our kiddos.
Thanks so much for sharing that, Meaghan. And just to clarify, but when you said earlier CLD, do you mean culturally and linguistically diverse students?
Yes,
Okay.
thank you. You know, we love our acronyms. We could use them all day long. Yes.
All right. And so Marnee, I'll go back to you.
Well, okay. Well, I was going to say, when I was talking about the things that I use to supplement the evaluations, that's exactly the word, is portfolio, because we would have the students also put in examples of some of their poetry or some of their artwork, or something to kind of indicate the array of talents. So I think portfolios are the best thing ever invented, is what I think. So good for y'all. I'm going to talk briefly about Camp Challenge because I thought it was a wonderful program. And I'm so sorry that I don't think it's being done anymore, because literally Texas brought in, I believe it was 24 students from all over the state who had qualified as gifted and talented. You know, they ranged from kids that had pretty good vision to kids that were Braille learners. So we had a wide variety. All of the kids, I think, if you gave them an IQ test, would have scored at least high average. They were a bright bunch. But what we did was we really tried to provide them with an opportunity to, number one, interact with peers. Number two, to really work on some problem-solving strategies. Strangely enough, one of the most effective problem strategies was getting them to plan a party at the end of the program, because it was amazing how all of the groups forgot silverware or forgot ice, you know, and that was a good way to kind of see how their organizational skills were. They did spelunking, they did all sorts of rope climbing activities, etc. Individual therapy, group therapy, etc. So it was a real all-encompassing program that was very, very exciting. The people that graduated from that, it's been nice to see the rate of success. I don't think it was because of Camp Challenge, but I think it was something that really helped them establish relationships with peers. What I would suggest now is if you have a student that you're looking for something like that, there's a program in Alabama, Huntsville, Alabama, that they literally get to go to a space camp for, I believe, a week now and work on all sorts of scientific concepts. And I think that's an area that we really fall down with students who are visually impaired. If they're interested in science, there's a whole lot of vision involved in some of those. But this was a real good opportunity for kids to go and really have the curriculum adapted for them. So as you have students come up, I think it's important to think about things for secondary students. In a lot of ways, it's easier with self-contained uh, elementary grades than it is when they get into high school. May, you're becoming a negative stimulus in my life.
Sorry. I just wanted to check if Kim, did you have anything you wanted to add?
Yeah, I do. With access to everything for our students who are blind and visually impaired, and especially our children, for us as parents, for me, it is about access. This is about getting appropriate materials in the media that your student needs them in. If your student is a Braille reader, you these materials need to be transcribed in Unified English Braille. And if they use Nemeth or if they use UEB Math Science, those materials need to be provided. Those assessments need to be provided in those formats with accessibility and with a collaborative process involving the teacher of students with visual impairments. If you're in a situation where you have a school psychologist and no TVI, no teacher of students with visual impairments in your county, that's something that really needs to be remedied because our kids cannot get fair assessment, whether it's for gifted and talentedness or if it's for special education, as Brian said earlier, the KTEA, the WISC, so many more. I have to tell you, I'm in this field. I live and breathe this field. To both of my daughters, when their assessments were done, they scored in the first percentile, one on the WISC and one on the VMI, the Visual Motor Index. And there was no collaboration. There were no accommodations in place. I'm the parent in that case, and I was stunned that there was no collaboration between the school psychologist, TVI, and getting those materials in accessible format. The way that we present these evaluations and assessments, for some of our kids, it's very simple. It might be reducing glare in the room. It might be increasing the light. It might be slant boards. It might be access to a video magnifier. It might be if it's a digital test, is that exam accessible? Does it meet WCAG standards? If my student is using JAWS, NVDA, narrator, voiceover, if they are using a Braille display, how are all these things working together? And so that's a really key component. And for those who are in this situation, you are asking and wondering about accessible assessments. How is my child going to be fairly evaluated? And I appreciate the comments about portfolios. I am 100% in support of that. I do want to reiterate the Department of Justice released the ADA Title II rulemaking that all elements of education are supposed to have accessible media. Some of that is potentially up for conversation right now in the current political environment, but some of our states have passed accessibility laws. So these evaluations that are not provided in accessible format, that is something that needs to change. And for us as parents, for us as teachers, and us as advocates, sometimes that means we have to be that mom, and I am that mom all the time. That means I have to go to Pearson and say, why is this evaluation not accessible? A lot of these assessments that, Brian talked about at the beginning, they are developed with the general population. They, of course, are not standardized on our kids at all. And they're responsible in their reporting. So I spoke about the visual motor index. the VMI in the booklet, it said this is not standardized on children who are blind and visually impaired. So we have to take everything with a grain of salt, but ensuring our kids are given at least the platform to do their best with that collaborative process is paramount.
Thank you so much, Kim, for bringing up those points. And I love it that you're advocating with the test publishers. I was just talking with a test publisher, PAR, earlier today, and I think it's great for them to hear all of our voices, trying to see what are they doing to help make their materials more accessible. So thank you for bringing up that point. Just in consideration of the time and all the other questions that we have, I'm going to move us along to question 4. Do you have any resources that we can use to cite to support the use of verbal-only cognitive measures? My district requires a global IQ for giftedness, but I'd like to cite maybe suggest using something more verbally focused. And I know that Brian and Meaghan have thoughts on this, and others do as well. So I'm going to hand it off to Brian, since he hasn't had a chance to speak in a bit, and then the rest of you can join in. Thank you.
Sure. So I'm working on, well, the draft is finished. So it focuses on how the WISC and the interpretation, it states how individuals who are gifted and talented, so these are individuals from the general population, their verbal scores are higher than their nonverbal scores, and then their performance on working memory and processing speed task are higher than the general population, but are lower than their verbal scores and nonverbal scores. So it is appropriate to use their general ability index score for identification in the gifted and processing, or in the gifted and talented identification process. So why is it that we can't use a different score when we're looking at identification of students who are visually impaired or blind? Because if we can use a different score for the general population in identifying gifted and talented, when we can identify reasons why those students have difficulty with other areas such as processing speed and working memory, and that they can't see, it should be logical to use that when the correlation and G-loading factor of the VCI is 0.83, which is the highest correlation of all the subtests on the WISC. It should be logical to use those. And it's worded much better, and there are citations and things, but so that's essentially why it says. And then I want to add things about considering those additional areas to add a portfolio. And it aligns to the Pfeiffer tripartite theory that I discussed in the first presentation. So again, there's a theoretical background for it as well. So.
Thanks, Brian. And Meaghan, did you have anything you wanted to add to that before we go to Mandy?
Yeah, again, I think if your district or state is requiring a standardized IQ measure to identify gifted, I think that is a good time to discuss some change in your district or in your state. So encouraging you to go to your state association, so your state school psych association. I would caution people on using the verbal only score as well. They just have lower reliability for our students with visual impairments. And this is included in the handout too, just for several reasons. You know, things like incidental learning, test item bias, over reliance on prior exposure, small norming populations. So even the verbal score, even though it might be better than an overall IQ score, it's still going to be depressed, and it's still in my opinion, not completely valid. So making sure that your district is having those conversations about how we can get a valid measure of a student's skills. And there are other ways of assessing a student's intelligence and creativity and problem solving skills and memory and all of those things. So again, going back to the dynamic assessments and the portfolio building to really delve into how a student learns, I think is going to be much more beneficial. And that's really going to drive instruction anyway. We talk about this with our school psychologists all the time. My IQ score or my standardized achievement score does not drive instruction. I can't write a goal. I can't plan instruction based on a standardized testing score. I can absolutely all day long plan based on, portfolio, a portfolio for a child or a dynamic assessment, because that's telling me how that student learns. And it's much easier to build in accessibility. Kim, what you said was beautiful and wonderful, and I love it. And I'm glad we're recording this. I'm going to play this over and share it. Just making everything accessible, and even for our standardized testing, like yes, the Woodcock Johnson can come in Braille, but again, like you've really got to think about the reasoning behind your, why you're evaluating, who you're evaluating, again, what their strengths and needs are, and then what's the ultimate goal of our evaluation. We want to know how that student learns and how we can best support them in an educational setting. So just keeping those things in mind when you're completing your evaluations and being intentional.
Thanks, Meaghan. And I'll go to Mandy and then Kim. But Kim, just in case you didn't see, there were some people going amen and yes to when you were talking earlier. All right, so Mandy and then Kim.
Oh, I think I'm contributing to the next question, May, not this one.
Okay, great. So Kim, did you have something else you wanted to add to this question before we move on?
Yeah, and they said it so beautifully. And there is research, Mullins and Moresh, the Stephen F. Austin University, which my colleagues here have highlighted on those inflated scores. But I also have worked with several students who have auditory processing disorder. It's actually somewhat common these days for us to find that on IEP teams to get requests and information about auditory processing. But that doesn't preclude our students from having gifted and talentedness. I do also want to say, because I teach our assessment course, we have school psychologists and other people who come in and say, well, if you enlarge the print for the student on that WISC test, or if you braille it up, that's an unfair advantage. And I'm here to tell you it is not. It is absolutely not. That doesn't give them any type of indication of any type of answers or support. It does take the student score right outside of the standard range. But IEP teams that have to determine which students get into the gifted and talented program need to take that into account. And just going along with that accessibility piece, I train teachers of the blind and visually impaired. My teachers are having to adapt these tests, each person individually. They cannot be shared out because, of course, they are copyrighted. And that is why we do need the main programs that the Woodcock Johnson that is offered from APH. But some of the other tests also need to be made in those formats. I would hope for electronic format, so they could be purchased, embossed off, printed off, font changed in size, and so much more.
Thank you for sharing about that, Kim. And just because you mentioned some specific tests, there are tests that are already in large print, but might need to be enlarged further for our student needs. More information about that kind of consideration is in the comprehensive evaluation guidance document that Marnee mentioned earlier. And she was a part of working on that document. She's too humble. But there are different ways to work with technology as well as hard paper copy to manage visual access or tactile access. But I just want to clarify for anyone who's on the call or watching the recording, if it's a standardized test, we want to have it adapted by a reputable publisher like the American Printing House for the Blind, since it's not just a straight transcription of print into Braille or like word for word, because sometimes they might omit an item that is unfairly biased, or they might omit a whole subtask or change things around so that it is appropriate for our students. So I know sometimes teachers of students with visual impairments get asked to put things into Braille, and generally it's okay, but there are specific copyright laws that apply to standardized tests where we should not be doing that because there are additional considerations that need to be made. And if there are no other comments on that question, I'm going to go ahead and move on to our next question about advocacy. Are there current advocacy efforts for public policy changes to address these issues when identifying and appropriately providing these services to blind and low vision students? And I'll hand it off to Mandy.
Okay. Well, when Brian and Meaghan and I met and discussed this, we were not aware of any advocacy efforts either at the federal or the state level. But because of the differences in GT education from state to state, we thought that it would be the best way to start by advocating at the state level. And a good point of contact would be the National Association for Gifted Children. They have a lot of state affiliates, and that might be a good starting point. And Meaghan was the one who shared with me that there's a report that they publish every year, although the most recent is from 2022-23, and it's called The State of the States. And that makes for some really interesting reading, just learning about how different states do gifted and talented education. In some states, and I know this through Meaghan as well, it's part of special education. Here in Texas, where I am, it is not. So just really interesting.
And thank you for sharing about that. Sorry, technical issues with my mouse. All right. Kim, did you have something else? Or Brian, did you want to add something else to that? Or should we move on?
I think it's good. Yeah.
Yeah, that's good.
Okay, great. So on our next question, number 6, what are some practical everyday social interventions for social emotional challenges for our gifted and blind or low vision students? And I believe Mandy, you're going to share a little bit on that.
Yeah, I can talk about that too. So I asked teachers here at TSBVI and also the school psychologists who work here if they had any recommendations for curriculum. And first of all, I think most of the teachers here do like daily check-ins just to model appropriate teacher, student, and student-to-student interactions. So that's like a quick and easy thing that can happen at the beginning of any class. And then they recommended the social thinking curriculum, which you might know through zones of regulation, and also something else called empowering education. But I just want to be clear that neither of these are adapted for use with blind or visually impaired students.
Thanks for sharing those, Mandy. And there are some curriculums or guides that are specifically for our students with visual impairments. I think I have a copy on my desk. So for social emotional, this is Empowered, an activity-based self-determination curriculum for students with visual impairments. I will find the link later and drop it into the chat, but this is actually from Texas, but it's a while ago. So sounds like they might not be using it anymore, but there's some great ideas in there. For social skills, there's also through APH. Oh my gosh, my brain is blanking at the moment, but my colleague worked on this, Stephanie Herlick. It's, I think, getting to know each other or something like that. I'll put it in the chat later. I hear my coworker shouting it, but my door's closed, so I can't hear it. But I'll put some other resources. Oh, getting to know you. Thank you, Rebecca. So I'll add that to our handout document. And there's some other ones that I know that I have in a list somewhere. I'll add it to our resource document later where they're more specifically for our students. But I know that things from social thinking are maybe more readily available. I know that our speech language pathologists really like the curriculum from Peers. This is out of UCLA, University of California, Los Angeles. It's research-based, it's great. They have various books and manuals where it's very step-by-step guides on how to facilitate groups and trainings. And I'll include links to this as well. This is not made specifically for students who are blind or low vision, but they're really great at being explicit in how they break down different social skills. And so the formatting of it, I think, is very nice in terms of how direct and simple and straightforward it is. And there are trainings that people can take to become implementers of this curriculum. So I'll write a note to myself to include those. Kim or Brian, did you have anything that you want to add for before we move on?
Sure. I just wanted to remind everybody that social self-determination, social skills are part of the expanded core curriculum, which are the areas that we as teachers of students with visual impairments do focus on. So if it's an area of need, that is a place to advocate in your child's IEP, whether they are gifted or not, if they are in the general ed or special ed. The ECC does have those areas covered, and I am super excited to check out the resources you just listed, May.
Great. And Brian, I believe you are on our next question about report writing. So could you please provide some templated report examples for this population? And I know that's a common question, but can be kind of challenging. So I'll let you take it away.
I think the original question was about if it's if the different types of visual impairments are too different to actually have a template. And I would say no, because it's kind of the same format. You just have to describe what the visual impairment is and how it might impact their programming for the Gifted and Talented program. But I think the key components are how they were referred, whether it was a parent or teacher referral, or they were caught through the screening program. Then kind of describe the background, their education history, then classroom observations. Some of the things you'd want to look at is how they're interacting with their peers. Are they turn taking with conversations? If they have any assistive technology, how are they using it? Are they using it correctly? Are they volunteering to answer questions? Are they able to complete their work independently? How fast are they completing it? Is it correct? Kind of like those interviews that Marnee was talking about. How do they feel about their visual impairments? Are they understanding like idioms, sarcasm? Can they describe their feelings? Then those parent and teacher interviews. Then going over the testing results, looking at some extracurricular achievements, like sports. There's some pretty cool sports in low vision, blindness, at schools for the deaf and blind, or if this is just typical school artistic achievements. Then compiling all that data, and depending on what your state is, how they classify different areas of giftedness, whether it's aptitude and achievement, creativity, problem solving, leadership, calculating it all, if they have a formula or if you just kind of check a box. And so I don't think it's typically that hard to have a templated report. Just putting them in whatever order you think makes the most sense to you, helping the team come up with a way to best describe that student, looking at all their strengths and how they might align to what your state, your district is looking for, and best ways to define your student in terms of their potential giftedness, and how they're able to use their visual impairments to the benefit of them. If that makes sense.
Thanks, Brian. And Kim, did you want to add anything to that?
I think that was great. Thank you.
Great. And so, Marnee, I believe we have you on for the next one. And the next question is, could you please provide a case study of a gifted and talented blind or low vision student?
Back. Y'all have a handout of a case study. The only reason I'm ever hesitant about providing a case study is that people will pick it apart in terms of it being a formal report. This is not a formal report at all. It just is kind of a summary of the type of data that I got, and the way that we would kind of summarize it to go over it with the parent. I would like to add, though, that you've got a whole PowerPoint that is included. And I thought it was a wonderful sign because the professional group that deals with gifted and talented in Texas asked me and Ann Korn and Susan Johnson, who is the former director at Baylor of the teacher training program for gifted and talented. They asked us to present something on how do you determine that for students who are visually impaired, which I thought was amazing that they were interested in doing that. And I don't know if y'all know Dr. Korn, but Dr. Korn has low vision herself, and she and Jane Aaron wrote one of the original books on how to both identify and program for students who are gifted and talented, as well as visually impaired. So I kind of felt like, as Texans would say, I was in high cotton presenting with those two women, because it very, very impressive. So the handouts are there, the PowerPoint. Now when I look at it, I see only things that I thought, oh my gosh, they were just terrible. But I do think the case study gives you just a general example of how we gather information from the student, from the parents, that we look at exactly what they need at that point in time, what are the priority educational needs, and kind of put it all together to make a recommendation about what needs to, if it's an appropriate time or not. And I stress to parents all the time, even if you've got the world's brightest child, this may not be the best type of program for them. So I think sometimes parents get so involved in advocating and wanting to be certain that their child is included, that they forget that their child is also an individual with their own needs, with their own desires, etc. And so the case study that you all have is something that tries to really talk about the student's needs, as well as the parent, as well as the documented ability level of the student. The other thing that I put in there that I thought y'all might find of interest, I did an article for past literacy a couple of years ago on how do you identify a student who is both visually impaired and gifted and talented. I would also change things about that if I wrote it now, but it's something that y'all have for reference if you're interested. And this time I'll cut it off short and may won't have to pop in again.
Thanks, Marnee. We love hearing from you. Mandy, I know you had some thoughts on this as well. Did you want to share what you were thinking about on this question?
Yes, actually, I just wanted to share that article, May, if you could drop that in the chat too, because it's not a case study of a student, but rather one parent's efforts and her journey to get her child appropriately recognized as gifted and talented, and her daughter had a visual impairment. So just the hoops that she had to jump through it's a really good like first person article that I wanted to share, and it's from the National Foundation of the Blind.
Thank you, Mandy. And Kim, did you want to share anything else on this topic?
I think what everybody is great.
Great, thank you. Marnee, any other thoughts? I just want to make sure everyone gets to chime in if they had anything else to share about this. No, okay. We'll
I'll be
move.
quiet for a change.
I wish we had more time just so we could listen to all your stories, Marnee, and all your experiences.
Sorry. That's one of the parts about being old is you have to put up with that stuff. So my apologies.
Oh, I love learning from your experience. Our next question, I believe Meaghan had some notes on our next question. How have some teachers taken recommendations from a psychoeducational report and implemented them in an inclusive setting rather than in a school for the blind setting? Could you provide some examples?
So, and I have a limited scope because I've only ever worked in Wichita Public Schools. So I can just kind of tell you how we do things here. We are very team-based with a team approach. So we, several years ago, moved away from just psychoeducational reports, and we now have multidisciplinary team reports. So it's the team working together to evaluate the student, including the general education teacher. So if so it's the team evaluating the child, the team making recommendations for the child, the team developing the IEP for the child, so any accommodations, modifications, or interventions that are needed. So sometimes I feel like some of our teams are functioning kind of in silos. Like, I'm the gen ed teacher, I'm going to do this. I'm the special education teacher, I'm going to do this. I'm the TSVI, I'm going to do this. I'm the gifted teacher, yada, 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 where we really need to work together and collaborate and communicate so we can ensure that the student has what they need throughout the entire school day. So the student's not just a visually impaired student when they're in with the TSVI. They're not just a gifted student when they're down in the gifted classroom. They're all of those things throughout the whole entire school day. So we work really hard to make sure that our general education teachers are really comfortable, or any para or any adult that's working with the student are comfortable with whatever accommodations or modifications the team has developed for that child. And we make sure we're available. So just like our students, need the I do, we do, you do, so do our teachers. So we make sure, again, that if a teacher isn't comfortable implementing something, that we go in and we model, do it with them, and then make sure that they're comfortable implementing anything that we have in the student's IEP. So I don't know if that fully answers your question, because I'm not sure, how you do things within your school district, but that's how we've handled things within ours.
Thanks, Meaghan. And Kim, did you have anything to share from your experience as a university professor and supervisor?
I mean, yeah, there are several elements. I really appreciate the model that was just provided for us, and creating that team and collaborative element as well. I echo that strongly.
I think for all of our students who are blind or low vision or deafblind, that team collaboration is so crucial to make sure that our students are getting appropriate access to all the different things in their environment to learn in so that they can thrive.
And I just have to say one more thing. I'm so sorry. So I know that we're really spoiled in our school district. We have TSVIs at our disposal, gifted teachers at our disposal, and I know not even all districts in Kansas have that. So if you're struggling to find support, reach out to your state education department. They have resources. They should have resources at the state level that can come collaborate with your school district. So again, it's just about advocating and asking to make sure that you have those resources available.
And I'm so glad that you shared that, Meaghan. So there's COSB, the Council of Schools for the Blind, and other organizations. And so not every state has a school for the blind. Sadly, a fair amount have closed. But there are other organizations. So I will put in the handout a link to COSB, because they do have a list of what's available in different states. So you can contact your state School for the Blind or other organization and see if they can provide some consultation. Like here at the California School for the Blind, we have a pretty robust outreach department where we provide a lot of consultations and presentations like this. So glad that you're all able to join us for this one to help support our state and others. So our next question is, what would you like assistive technology consultants to know about this unique student profile? And I believe that Kim and Meaghan, you both have some things you'd like to share about this. So Kim, would you like to start?
I do, and I'm a really strong advocate that the blindness and visual impairment realm is not as well represented in general assistive technology. So we have wonderful AT specialists. Our school system has amazing AT people. But when it comes to blindness and visual impairment, it kind of just stops short. ACVREP does credential a professional called the Certified Assistive Technology Information Specialist, which is blindness and visual impairment specific. And then teachers of the visually impaired are generally required to take some type of coursework on technology and so much more. But it's been my experience that very, very well-meaning, incredible assistive technology people get called into work with a situation. They may only know that there's something out there called a screen reader and screen enlargement and a braille display, and Learning Ally and a few other options. But they get very nervous in my experience when there's a child who's blind, low vision that needs access to the platforms, the assessment protocol. When your child does get admitted to gifted programs, they may be using some really cumbersome and detailed engineering software, or they might be coding, or they might be doing math and on different types of programs. And where does that convergence happen with how is my student going to access these programs, this assessment, this portfolio they're putting together for consideration in the gifted program? And then how do we meet their AT needs? So in my experience, there's just been a lot of back and forth in the AT field and with the TVIs. A lot of us are, we are really dedicated to our craft, but I'm not the best technology person out there, but I do know the blindness technology, but I don't know some of the other things that go on. So I also really want to advocate that collaboration piece. Our school systems need to procure, they need to search for and buy accessible WCAG and platforms, software, testing devices, and any type of, if they're doing a coding program, if or whatnot, they need to be accessible. And so I see a wide variety of things that happen in this realm. And if I could change that everybody understood blindness technology to an extensive degree, I would. And it is an area of need. It's an area of need I identify in my program as well. And in programs for assistive technology specialists that are not blindness focused, which are most of the AT folks in our school systems.
Thanks so much, Kim. And Meaghan, did you have anything else you wanted to share about this, about assistive technology?
Just echoing what Kim said, beautifully said. Again, that collaboration piece. So our AT specialists work with our TSVIs pretty heavily, and they do a great job. Our TSVIs are, I have one that is very good at technology, and she is always saying, hey, look at this new thing. Do we have the budget to purchase this new thing? And luckily our district has been very accommodating. But again, making sure that it's meeting the visual the visual needs of the student, but also not capping the students. So again, we've got to blend the student's disability with their exceptionality. So looking at the visual impairment and the giftedness. And so that, again, it just takes teamwork and collaboration.
Yeah, definitely hearing some themes from all your responses throughout this webinar about dynamic and portfolio assessments and collaboration. Dream work makes a teamwork. All right, and so I'm going to move us along to our next question since we only have about 15 minutes left, and we do have some questions from the chat as well that we'll try to squeeze in if we can get through the next few quickly. So what are the best ways to support a blind or low vision student who's gifted and talented? And I have down Marnee, Kim, and Meaghan who would like to share their thoughts. Since you just spoke, Meaghan, I'll hand it off to Kim so that you can take a little breather.
I'm just going to first respond as a parent because that is my most important role. The best way I can support my child is to be that advocate in the IEP, to ensure that she is getting the accommodations that she needs. I cannot help her with her homework. I don't understand it. AP physics and calc, I can braille it. Like if she needed it in braille, I can braille it in Nemeth, I can braille it in UEB math science. But having her vision needs met and knowing how to use her accommodations, that is the best support I can provide because I can't help her with her homework. But if she has equitable access, then she can do it herself and she's capable of doing it herself. When we redid our kitchen, we had this large desk type thing put in because assistive technology for our kids with low vision takes up a lot of space. And the designer said, that's out of style. I'm like, I don't care. She has her Visio book. We have an accessible calculator. She has a computer with a monitor. She has her own computer in her room. She does get large print. She does get adaptive devices. And so for me, ensuring that those accommodations are in place is key. I also am a huge advocate for having a massive toolbox. So she has low vision, but I did request, and I had the school also teach her screen reading apps, because when you have low vision, you are prone to missing things, commas, periods. You might misspell a word and it appears as a different word, and sometimes it's really difficult to hear that back. Braille is fantastic for that. Also, as a way to supplement learning how to use a good, robust screen reading program, not text to speech, but screen reading. And I did get pushback on that quite a bit, and that took a lot of advocacy, but she's capable of being an excellent writer and being able to access JAWS and proofread is something that is very beneficial. So learning how to use her devices, we can't just give kids these devices and say, I know you have low vision, you know how to use this video magnifier. Actually, sometimes it takes some instruction to be able to move between distance and near, to right under those video magnifiers, to pack it up safely and transport it throughout the school safely. So that for me was the most important. And I, for my students as well.
Thanks, Kim. And Meaghan, would you like to share on this?
Yeah, I'll be super quick. So there's 3 things that we focus on with our kiddos. So thoughtful planning, accessibility considerations, which Kim talked about quite a bit, and then a commitment to inclusive practices. So we've done a lot of training the last couple of years on UDL, which is the Universal Design for Learning, and that is a great platform on considering accessibility for all of the students within your classroom at any point in time. So it provides a really nice layout for our teachers, so they can, again, what's the content that I'm focusing on and how can I make that accessible for each of my students? So if you don't know about UDLs, there's a lot of research and information. So I encourage you again to go do some professional development on that subject.
And yes, I see in the chat, people are really enjoying everyone's specific recommendations, and we love a list of all these practical tools. And Marnee, would you like to share on some of your thoughts on the best ways to support a blind and low vision student who's also gifted and talented? I know earlier you shared some thoughts about thinking about timing and purpose in a student's day, and whether or not the gifted and talented program would be a good use of their time, or maybe other things outside of the school setting.
And I'm sorry, all of a sudden I'm having trouble with the sound. Just in terms of things that parents can do.
Oh, or what are the best ways to support a blind and low vision student who's gifted and talented? I know you were sharing some thoughts earlier on thinking about whether or not the gifted and talented program within a school is actually maybe the best option or not for exploring and supporting our students' gifts and talents, or other ideas. So
Oh, yeah.
share your thoughts about
Oh,
that.
I've always got an idea. I'm sorry. I think we need to keep in mind, number one, the expanded core curriculum, because I think those are the things that will help people live a full life, to be able to do the things that they need to live independently. And I keep up with enough ex-students to know that that is a critical piece. The other thing that I feel like we fall short on is teaching leisure skills, kind of social skills. So much of it is directed by adults, that is the loneliness and the inability to fill time with anything but, uh, kind of passive entertainment, I think is a real critical piece that will contribute to success and happiness, the quality of life. And to me, that is an advocate and a psychologist. That's really a critical piece. Not just how well they read, but how well they're living life as a citizen and a member of a community. And I think the time to start that is when they're in school, where you've got that support.
Thanks, Marnee, and everyone else. We have about 8 minutes to address our last two questions, and there are several comments and questions that we'll try to get to if we can. So, Mandy, if you could quickly summarize your response for, are there studies examining the experiences of blind and low vision students in gifted and talented programs?
Short answer, no. I did a search of the literature and I found only 3, and none of them examined students in a GT program. The one that was probably most applicable was in the Journal of Visual Impairment and Blindness, but it's from 1995, and it's talking about 3 gifted students with deaf blindness in Pennsylvania, and it was weighing the benefits of them being not in a specialized program, but in the general ed program. So that was the closest I could find, but I couldn't find anything about a GT specific program.
Thanks, Meaghan. I'll put your notes about that in the chat. And our last question that was submitted before the webinar is, or comment and question, I would like guidance on having both a gifted IEP and a separate 504 for vision concerns, or should the vision accommodations go on the IEP? The student does not yet meet the indicators for vision impairment, but may someday, since their eye condition is degenerative. And I'll go to Kim for that.
Absolutely. I just pasted a link into the chat. This is from the Office of Special Education Programs. It was published in November of 2022. It was based off of a letter from an OCR complaint in 2017. I'm addressing the second half of the question about the student not meeting the parameters for visual impairment eligibility. And there was a huge misconception across the United States that you had to be legally blind or meet certain visual acuity or field requirements to be found eligible for visual impairment. And that is not the case. The Individuals with Disabilities Education Act which is what qualifies a student for an IEP if they are found eligible, does say that even with the student's best corrected visual acuity, they are still adversely impacted in accessing education. So in the video, Dr. Rebecca Sheffield and her colleagues discuss that misconception that you have to meet certain parameters. We are required as TVIs to assess that student and look for impact. How is their eyesight impacting them? Does that mean that a student who has 20/20 eyesight but is so impacted by glare that they can't function in a typical classroom, going outside is dangerous, or for whatever reason? Yes, that student could be found eligible if the team determines that that child's education is impacted. Here in Virginia, we thankfully had the right language in our law, but several other states in the United States actually got dinged by the US Department of Education because they only included those parameters for visual acuity and field of vision. And really, the federal law does say if there's any condition. So when we have kids who have cortical, cerebral visual impairment, visual processing, a degenerative condition, which is also specified in the law, they can be found eligible. So we are going to look for that impact on education, and they do not have to meet very specific acuity and requirements. The question about the IEP versus the 504. So an IEP is used when a child has been found eligible for special education because they require access to specialized services. 504 plans can just do accommodations. So like, again, that child that's impacted by glare, maybe they don't need an IEP, but we need to mitigate the glare in the classroom for them. The IEP means that I, as a TVI, I might be providing instruction how to use those accommodations, how to use that technology. It might be monitor consult, where I'm consulting with the teachers and helping them understand how to make in-class accommodations, or I could be providing very direct services for that student depending on their specific needs. So yes, that I saw you come onto the screen, May. So
Yeah, sorry, I'm becoming a negative.
I know.
No, thank you so much for sharing about that. Kim, I linked in the chat as well the OSEP letter that you
Yes,
referenced.
thank you.
5. This is one that I refer people to constantly because some states, their regulations for VI eligibility are not aligned with the federal regulations. And the OSEP letter clearly states that we cannot narrow the federal regulations. We should be following our federal regulations. And so it very clearly lays that out. And I know that even some states like Wyoming, their state regs have things like acuity or fields or like things that narrow it. I can't remember off the top of my head, but their Department of Education has provided guidance documents and a presentation on, even though our law says one thing, you actually should be doing what the federal regulations say. The law just hasn't been updated yet. So I know that's happening across the United States where people are starting to get that aha moment from getting in trouble, like you mentioned. And Meaghan, I saw that you popped on. Did you have anything else that you wanted to add about that? About IP 504?
Yeah, I don't. So in Kansas, gifted does fall under special education. So we do have gifted only IEPs, which gifted is an exceptionality. It's not a disability. So we do blend for our gifted only students. If they need a 504, we do determine that they're eligible for 504. And then once we determine that eligibility, we absorb those accommodations onto the IEP, and it's selfishly for less paperwork. But if that student were to ever not have a gifted IEP anymore, then they would still have a 504 plan. So I didn't know if that helped answer some of the that person's question. It's really dependent on your state and whether gifted falls under special education or not, and your state regulations. Some of our districts in Kansas for our gifted only kiddos do have a gifted IEP, and they also have a 504 plan. So again, our kiddos still have both. We just absorb it into one document, if that helps answer that person's question.
Thanks so much for adding that, Meaghan. And to piggyback on that, all of what we're providing here is information. If you have questions, you as an educator, maybe ask your directors, program specialists, or your own district's legal counsel, but please share with them these documents that Dr. Kim and I have shared in the chat. We'll also put it in the main handout because some people, because this is such a niche population, such a low incidence population, they just might not know what they don't know. And so I know that we're getting really close to the end, and we did have a parent question that I want to try to squeeze in real quick. I would love any thoughts on kids with low vision who are learning a musical instrument and learning to read sheet music. If anyone has any thoughts, feel free to go on mic to share. I know that our music teacher has connections with various agencies that have ideas and strategies for that I can add to the handout later. Seeing no one else unmiking for that. Well, if everyone can come on screen for our last minute or so, I want to thank everyone for submitting their questions, for this great conversation, and for all the panelists and our hardworking ASL interpreters for joining us for this webinar. We have more webinars in this series, and so happy that there's such great interest in helping to serve our students who are blind, low vision, or deafblind. Thank you everyone for joining us today.